Thanks all for joining us today for our panel, The Path to Net Zero, Cleantech Through the Lens of Impact. I'm Laura Pierpoint. I'm coming to you today from Actuate Climate, which is a brand new nonprofit specifically designed to focus on accelerating greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And we do that by demonstrating breakthrough radical pathways for getting to speed and scale for greenhouse gas reductions. So what do we mean when we say net zero? Hopefully everyone who's joining us today is well aware of the need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in order to forestall the worst impacts of climate change. It's really important that globally, economy-wide, we get to a point where we are taking out as much greenhouse gas emissions as we are putting into the atmosphere. And that is a huge task. We are not on the right track yet. We need to bend the curve really dramatically to start reducing greenhouse gas emissions and pulling more greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere as quickly as possible. We need to do that all across the economy, across a lot of different technologies and in a lot of different spheres. So today we're going to talk about three big pillars associated with achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions. The first is radical efficiency. So this is doing more with less. The second is decarbonization, really reducing the greenhouse gas emissions associated with a lot of the processes that we have in place throughout our economy. And the third is greenhouse gas management. So this is acknowledging that we're already kind of past the point of no return on just reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We actually need to start thinking about pulling this stuff out of the atmosphere. I've got a great group of three panelists here today, and they're going to introduce themselves and talk about what they think are some of the most important pieces of this puzzle. One big theme to watch for as we talk today is to understand that there isn't a single solution or a single answer to this problem. If anyone comes to you and says, all we need to do is this technology, or all we need to do is implement this policy, don't believe them. We need innovations across the economy. We need lots of technologies. We need innovations in business models. We need different ways of doing finance. We need all of this together if we're actually going to solve this problem. So with that, I'll go ahead and launch us in and start with Jessie Revest. Jessie's going to give an overview of the three pillars and help us really kind of anchor our understanding on what needs to and what could happen within each of these pillars. And then she'll dive deep on the radical efficiency side. Over to you, Jessie.
Thanks, Lara. By way of introduction, I'm Jessie Revest. I'm a PhD scientist turned R&D engineer, turned clean tech research director, turned entrepreneur or intrapreneur. For the last 7 years, I've been at Xerox PARC leading the clean tech research portfolio. And today I'm heading up the Xerox Clean Tech business, which aims to commercialize some of the gems in this research portfolio, with the North Star really being greenhouse gas mitigation. And so as we look at this, we see these three horizons that Laura has described, the first being radical efficiency, the second being decarbonization, the third being greenhouse gas management. And we see these as really time staged. The first thing we need to do is use less stuff. Now, I'll go a little bit deeper into that in a minute, but unfortunately we're too late in that. So we need to do it as fast as possible. But because we didn't implement this many decades ago, we're going to need to also decarbonize our economy. And to first order, that means switching away from fossil and to cleaner fuels like electricity and hydrogen. And then finally, we messed up those first two, and unfortunately, we're going to have to do number three, which is greenhouse gas management. How do we clean up the decades of greenhouse gas pollution that we have made and that we're continuing to make? And there's a fourth pillar that we won't talk about in this panel. It's beyond the scope, but because we'll probably mess up all three of those, ultimately we'll need to think about geoengineering and adaptation. But for now, really focusing on those first three. So going a little bit deeper with radical efficiency, it's not radical energy efficiency only, it's even broader than that. And the thing that nobody wants to hear, it's not a huge business or an exciting technology, is that there are some behavioral and structural issues that we need to address with regards to not consuming so much, not wasting food, and not ordering everything that comes to mind on Amazon that we can now do in just one click. And so I really like thinking about the Goodwill and Craigslist as pretty impressive clean tech companies. They certainly didn't set out to be clean tech companies, but those sorts of business model innovations could really help encourage behavioral efficiencies. And also in radical efficiency, we have vehicle lightweighting. Any vehicle that's transporting goods or people, the lighter it is, the less fuel it uses. And so that is one really major theme within radical efficiency. And the last that comes to mind for me is buildings. And the 40% of building energy is going to HVAC. 28% of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from buildings. So we've got a lot of these emissions tied up in our HVAC system. And to the extent we can get smarter control of that, and better hardware, that can go a long way too. So let me stop there.
Great. That's a super helpful overview. All right, so Johanna, can you go ahead and go next, actually, and we'll talk a little bit about greenhouse gas management and also a bit about your background.
Absolutely. So great to be with you guys. I'm Johanna Wolfson. I am an investor and co-founder and principal at Prime Impact Fund. So we're investing in early stage companies, really at the seed and Series A stage, mostly hardware-based companies that are unlikely to get off the ground with conventional venture support. The reason we focus there is because if we're going to achieve deep decarbonization, which is what brings us all together today, we're going to need to do more than kind of innovate in software and data analytics. We need to also rehaul how we do industrial processes and infrastructure like transportation and manufacturing. So we know that pertains to the physical world, but we also know that the conventional financial instruments that have been developed don't always support that as well. So that's where we're focused on at Prime. We do that using kind of unique catalytic capital. And it has, sent us down some interesting paths in terms of where can we support companies that are really innovative, maybe in sectors that haven't changed very much, but that cross with very significant carbon sources. And so we're not even sector focused. We're looking for big emissions impact wherever we can find it. And so we actually touch on all of the areas, Laura and Jesse, that you mentioned up front in terms of, deep efficiency, in terms of decarbonization, and in terms of greenhouse gas management. And we've made investments in all those areas, but really an area that I've focused on very deeply at Prime has been greenhouse gas management for exactly the reason stated up front, that really when we look at the climate models, and this is becoming especially clear really in the last couple of years as kind of conventional climate models are being rerun, we won't get all the way there by achieving efficiency measures and decarbonization. Even if we're as successful as we dream on those, it's not going to allow us to abate sufficiently to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. So we're going to need to take carbon out of the air, or carbon equivalents out of the air, on the order of 5 to 20 gigatons a year within about the next 10 years. So to put that in perspective, most estimates suggest that over the next decade plus, we'll need to reduce our total gigaton usage of CO2 by about 70. And so, it turns out now it's clear that a very large fraction of that is going to have to be removing carbon or other harmful gases from the air. So, when you hear about carbon removal, people are talking about lots of different things that can be kind of natural approaches, which have to do with afforestation and reforestation, tree growth that can take carbon out of the atmosphere, soil sequestration, just equipping soil and plants to better hold carbon in the soil and in their roots. Technological approaches, which is where we more tend to focus on at Prime, given our orientation, as I described, things like direct air capture, taking carbon directly out of the air. We think of this as kind of synthetic trees. Enhanced weathering, so actually encouraging the natural reaction between minerals and CO2 to bind them, but just finding ways to accelerate that process. And then there are combined natural and technological approaches as well that we've looked at. We've now made a few different investments in this area, which I'm happy to speak about. And then, there are less obvious things that we need to focus on with greenhouse gas management as well. Some of those are methane, which is many, many, many times more potent than CO2. Methane is released from permafrost as it's melting. Methane is released in very, very large quantities by cows. It's one of the largest sources of agricultural emissions, which themselves are a huge source of global emissions. And nitrous oxide is another one that doesn't get talked about much, but nitrous oxide coming from runoff from overuse of fertilizer is also extremely potent greenhouse gas and is high emitting. These last two coming from kind of agricultural sources, these are really, really tricky. It's all hard, but agricultural emissions are especially hard to curb. These tend to be in industries that are very well protected for good reason. We want to take good care of farmers and encourage livelihood, but can we do that in a way that that helps, that can curb agricultural emissions overall? So that's kind of the broad scope. As I mentioned at Prime, we tend to focus on the more technological approaches, but is a lot of interesting work going on kind of on the natural approaches and how do we better use land to sequester carbon.
Awesome. Thanks, Shauna. That's a great, helpful introduction. And so now we'll turn over to Alex. So Alex, tell us a little bit about you and about what we need to do in the realm of decarbonization to get to net zero.
I'd be happy to. Thank you. My name is Alex Kizer. I'm a Senior Vice President for Research at the Energy Futures Initiative. That's a clean energy think tank based in Washington, D.C., founded by former Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz and some of his longtime colleagues, Melanie Kenderdine and Joe Kizer. I've been with EFI for about 4 years, and before that, I focused on another intractable issue, cybersecurity. So, I'm definitely passionate about a lot of energy industry issues, and spent a lot of time talking to technology entrepreneurs, state and federal policymakers, and industry investors to kind of think through, as I'm here to talk about, kind of the decarbonization tools and how are we supposed to kind of push those into the market. So we think a lot about how to reduce this burden, this load of emissions that's on the Earth system. And I think we really think through a few approaches that really reflect and focus on the social and economic realities of today. This is really starting with jobs, right? So, we talk a lot about advanced technologies, we talk a lot about sectors and a lot about these really difficult issues, but at the end of the day, we're going to need people who either develop the technologies, work on the markets, pushing these technologies into the field, and then we also need to think about, the folks that are manufacturing all this stuff. And I think if we don't have like a strong, robust workforce set up to kind of support this whole system, it's just not going to happen, regardless of what the policy has to say. Related to that, I think the regional dynamics of technologies that we're seeking to deploy is also really important. For example, not every state in the country has the same kind of local air quality issues, has the same kind of natural capabilities, whether we're talking about carbon dioxide removal that Joanna just said, or access to railways, access to waterborne transportation, these sorts of things. So we really got to think about solutions that reflect those regional realities. And I think if we're going to talk about technology decarbonization levers that are most kind of potentially impactful, I'd cheat a little bit and I'd choose those that I'd say are cross-cutting. So I would probably start with fuel switching away from high carbon intensive or GHG emissions intensive fuels to ones that are low and zero carbon. This is, again, a little cheating, but fuels are really important to how the energy system operates. They're from a storability standpoint, from being able to move these molecules around and storing energy, then that we can transform that energy to make it usable. That's a flexibility that the energy system has always had since really the modern energy system was created, and something that it'd be really hard to lose. I think another thing that's somewhat related is developing some long duration energy storage options for the electric grid. there's all sorts of technologies, especially in electricity, that we're seeing really rapid development, deployment, wind, solar, etc. Long duration and seasonal storage options is something that we still don't have really robust, clean options for. This is really important. And the third, which is, I probably should have led with, but renewables. We don't, sometimes we avoid them in these conversations, but all of the analysis that we at EFI have done, are going to require a huge deployment of renewables. This is, of course, focused mostly on electric grid decarbonization, but as I'm sure we'll talk about today, electrification of end uses is a really important tool in our toolbox for decarbonizing the economy, and a clean electric grid is what enables that. And so renewables are really important. Again, it may sound obvious, but something that we definitely should not overlook as we go forward. And happy to talk about any of these things in greater detail.
Well, that's awesome. Thanks to all of you. So I think at this point, I want to turn it back to Jesse with a specific question. So at Actuate, I mentioned how really what we're trying to do is demonstrate radical new breakthroughs and solutions to greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And the way that we do that is we think about sort of specific pain points in the system, so specific barriers, and then figure out how do we bring people together and institutions together across traditional silos to do that. So to give some examples, we have some ideas on programs and things like demand response. This speaks back to what you were discussing, Alex, as a way to support renewables deployment. But the idea here is that we would have not just demand response providers, but have utilities and regulators and folks who understand the social side of demand response together in the same room, working on new sort of more complete solutions. Another idea we have in the realm of carbon management, which relates to what Johanna was talking about, is demonstrating land-based carbon mineralization farms. It's a pretty simple idea. Spread out rocks, watch as they absorb CO2 naturally. There are certain rocks that do this, but there's a lot we don't know about how well that works. And can we design those systems in a way that brings in the kind of folks who design carbon offsets, who actually can monetize the results of what we do, so that these things are more immediately scalable. So the things that we're thinking about in terms of ideas and this sort of cross-silo approach really strongly came to mind as you were talking about efficiency and about the fact that there's sort of this uncomfortable side to this, which is that it's about people, it's possibly about behavior change, it's about new kinds of systems and maybe even new kinds of business models to get at this stuff. So can you say a bit more about what do you think are some of the technologies that you're really excited about to drive efficiency, and what else besides the technology itself do you really need to bring to bear to make these real?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Laura. I'm glad to hear that you're thinking about this in such a holistic way. And it actually resonates a lot with the history of Xerox PARC that was founded in 1970 as the future of the office company. And they had ethnographers sitting in the same room with computer scientists and physicists trying to figure out how to put all of those minds together to understand, well, if you did take a computer and turn it from an entire room into a handheld device, what would that mean? And that's how the graphical user interface came into being. What you see is what you get, WYSIWYG. And so this has really deep roots in the history of PARC and in our approach to clean tech. And when we've been thinking about energy efficiency, we're thinking about these same themes of what do people really want? Efficiency already today pays for itself in most instances, and yet people aren't doing it because it doesn't pay quite enough. So we're looking at various angles of this. One that has come up is this Craigslist and Goodwill approach of how do you make some behavioral change easier for people to do. And then another one that we're looking at with the pandemic is what are some other benefits of energy efficiency that have nothing to do with being green or that feel good behavior. It's something deeper that someone really wants. And luckily or unluckily, the pandemic has really opened our eyes to air quality. And so to the extent you can figure out how to give people better air quality while also saving them money, there's real opportunity there. And that can come in the form of hardware that's doing better air handling. It can also come in the form of sensors and control systems that can actually detect what our air quality is and do something about it. So we're looking at all those ancillary benefits as well as saving energy.
Can I just jump in and underscore that point? When we're considering an investment in an energy efficiency technology, whether it's an HVAC or air conditioning or windows or something else, sure, the ROI based on energy savings, it needs to be there for us to be interested from an impact standpoint, but it cannot remotely be the argument for why we think the product would achieve market adoption. It needs to be totally driven by other consumer preferences, whether those are comfort or aesthetics, or could be air quality, as Jesse mentioned. And that needs to be the primary driver, and energy efficiency and savings needs to be sort of the pleasant side effect.
You're right. Yeah, I think really what you guys are highlighting is this sort of issue that's common to a couple of different, potential solutions in the climate world, where just because it pencils out from a financial perspective doesn't mean it's necessarily how everything is going to work. There are other challenges, there are other kind of transaction cost barriers. And so Alex, that actually leads to another question. Renewables, as you mentioned, really important pillar of decarbonization, really cheap right now, but not necessarily happening as fast as they should everywhere they should. So what's going on? Why can't we do 100% renewables tomorrow? What's the challenge here, and how do we overcome it?
I will definitely answer your question. Can I jump in on the last discussion a little bit? So something else that I mentioned, local issues and challenges, or opportunities that is really foundational to success here. Something we've seen that's kind of an issue in energy efficiency, just to point out, is just building ownership. And in certain cities like New York City, for example, who owns the building, who's incentivized to take on the action to reduce energy use, and obviously demand in the system is something that is like just really hard to overcome. I think there's, it's relatively simpler than some of the other things we're talking about, but it's the type of lever, or whatever we want to call it, that we have to think through when we think through when we're thinking through things like, what are the costs and all these other categories. There's all these other kind of factors that we really need to think about solutions in. So I think, I don't want to get into the debate around sort of grid modeling approaches for 100% renewables. I think it's safe to say that there's a lot of studies that show that it's technically feasible to run an electric grid on, pretty much all renewables with probably some battery storage support. I think there's two reasons why we might not, there's a few reasons why we might not want to do that. I think costs, risks, and then something else that is really important to kind of the work that we do, I would just say, is sort of optionality is important. But I think on the costs, let's start with the risks, because it's pretty apropos of what's been going on, some of the things we've seen in Texas in February with the power outages. But the risks of climate change, changing climate, wildfires, extreme heat, a lot of things that we've seen in California, right? We'll also probably see things. I was on a call earlier where there's a lot of discussion around kind of wind patterns changing due to climate change. And so if we're about to site and permit a wind farm and the wind's not there anymore, we have a serious problem. And so I think how these kind of climate change related actions, effects could pose a lot of risk for running an electric grid that runs things like hospitals, military establishments, and pretty much all of our lives. On the cost point, and I don't want to get too much into it because, of course, cost change, policy intervention can affect that. And I'm sure Johanna would have a lot more to say on that than I would. But we did a study recently on New England's grid decarbonization, and I mentioned fuels before. We did one scenario that was no fuels, and one scenario that was all renewables and storage, and the cost of the electric grid in the no fuels, that is the all renewables and storage, was 5 times the cost of overall system costs than if we let a little bit of sort of natural gas with CCS, for example, available. So, I mean, these are serious cost issues, especially when we're talking about at this scale. And there's obvious, operational challenges that I mentioned that might be related to climate change. And so this just leads to the optionality point, right? Like, it doesn't have to be 100% renewables. The goal is, net zero carbon, right? And so let's think about a system that is carbon free and how that operates, that respects all these regional jobs, all these factors that I mentioned. I think that should be really our target.
Oh, that's a great point. Really thinking about keeping our eye on the prize, that the goal is carbon and not necessarily a single solution, is really critical. Great. Okay, Johanna, so to turn to you, I want to dig in a little bit. You mentioned agriculture. That's a super challenging space. But I'm just curious to know, are there any solutions out there that you think are particularly exciting or important in the agriculture space? And then overall, in the carbon dioxide removal space, what do you think are the biggest bangs for our buck? What do you think are the really exciting negative emissions technologies out there?
Yeah, so in ag, there's a lot that, ag is so interesting, especially as a venture investor, because there is a lot of dollars going into ag. Ag tech is very, it's a very active field, but we don't always see that crossing with where the relevant emissions are. So we see a lot of dollars going into, kind of cloud infrastructure for ag tech, ag biz marketplaces, et cetera. We don't see as much in, some of the areas that I mentioned around methane emissions. So that's a big one. We've looked at a lot of companies. We're kind of looking for the right one. We've looked at a lot of projects that are focused on reduction of methane in cows. There are different approaches, some of them seaweed based or about methanogenesis within the cow rumen. Some of them around actually wearables that would actually take the methane and catalyze it to a lower greenhouse gas emitting substance. And that's actually an area that we're really focused on.
You mean wearables for cows? Just checking.
Bird bags, right?
Yeah, it's fascinating, and something's going to happen here, right? I don't know when, and that's sort of the big question around a lot of these policy questions. And this is what is so interesting to me. I'm glad Alex mentioned it, is that the tech policy interaction. What we hear a lot, so venture investors are typically quite hesitant to do investing where there's policy risk. On the other hand, policymakers are absolutely, whether directly or indirectly, watching the tech landscape because it only makes sense to have a carbon price that's, in excess of $50 if the technology could ever deliver on that. So there's some interaction, and we're really interested in kind of finding that place of interaction and really pushing the technology to the point where policymakers might take notice and there's an interaction effect. In terms of other areas, so a couple of them have been mentioned already, but I would say the areas we're probably most focused on outside of methane emissions in ag, but in greenhouse gas management more generally would be direct air capture. We've made one investment in that area. We've made one carbon sequestration investment, mineral carbonation, which I think, Laura, you mentioned in terms of, kind of spreading rock and causing enhanced mineralization of the CO2 binding. That's an area we're very interested in. And then there's a lot of activity on CO2 to value. In terms of converting CO2 to plastics or converting CO2 to fuels, we tend to look for where are the opportunities that could be, again, that gigaton scale emissions reduction. A lot of those kind of CO2 to material plays could be interesting and could be compelling from an economic standpoint, but might not be selling into a market that could have a gigaton scale impact. But one that does approach that scale of impact is CO2 to fuels. So that's an area that we're watching closely as well, that we haven't made an investment in yet.
Very exciting stuff. So I think, this is really great, because I think what you guys have all thrown out here are a lot of different potential ideas, a lot of ways that we could actually get to greenhouse gas emissions reduction. But we have one big problem. How do we prioritize, right? We can't do everything all at once. So I'd be curious, any of you, to jump in on this around how do we actually make some decisions around what to do first, specifically with respect to where investment should be going, and maybe also with respect to where policy should be focusing? Any ideas on what really is like the next biggest, most important thing we should be doing, biggest bang for our buck? Jesse, maybe we'll start with you.
I'm going to jump in with the McKinsey abatement plot and say we want to see, if we have $100, where can we spend the first 50 to have maximum impact? And then maybe we want to be a little bit strategic about staging with the next ones. I think generally we'd like to go in the order of efficiency, then decarbonization, then greenhouse gas management, because that efficiency stretches out over time and makes the other two easier. So we'd love to hammer on that hard, but if we look at the McKinsey abatement plot, it's going to be clear where to start spending money. And for the audience who may not be aware of the McKinsey abatement plot, it's a now 11-year-old plot, I believe, showing how much it costs to mitigate per ton of CO2 based on different technologies, from energy efficiency all the way through to carbon capture, land management practices.
Yeah.
And many of them are negative. They just have to be implemented.
That's a great point. And I think, there's a really good analog if you're thinking about your own house, right? You want to do your efficiency improvements first before you buy your solar panels. Because if you buy your solar panels first and then you do a whole bunch of efficiency improvements, now you've got way more power than you need, right? So ideally, we would go really big and really fast on efficiency. And then that will show us exactly what we need to do in these other sectors in decarbonization and greenhouse gas management. That's a great point. How about you, Alex?
And I'll jump in there. So I think that's, I totally agree with that framework. I think I might say you need to start budgeting for the solar panels at the same time that you're paying for the energy efficiency. And that's, I think, a slight difference, but I think an important one, right? I think we need to start working on a lot of things right now. And we have been, actually, and we'll probably talk about some of these technologies more detail, but I'd say a framework that really helps us think about this, and I know I already mentioned, but technology optionality. We need options across all sectors. I know Laura said that, and I think that's a great point. And agriculture has been brought up a lot. We did a study on California decarbonization, and we looked at agriculture and basically heavy industry as two really difficult to decarbonize sectors for different reasons, and a lot of reasons, but together they account for 34% of the state's emissions. That's like no joke, right? So, and we need as many wearables, we need as many new diets for cows, we need, to not eat as much beef. We need to do all of it at the same time. Now, of course, that does get to like, what is the action to take, which is really important. And I do think that spending on innovation is really important end to end. So that's not just basic R&D, and that's not just pushing things into market, but the whole thing, because we're going to need more technologies than we have today, probably, to reach something like economy-wide net zero. And policy was mentioned. And so usually I think of policy as like flexible policy is something that's really important. We need policy that both supports and is informed by climate change and decarbonization. And I think this is just, for example, I might, instead of doing a McKinsey curve, MAC curve based off of costs, I might do it based off of challenges and see where challenges group around certain technologies to then make a policy informed decision. So like, for example, I'd say permitting, the infrastructure permitting is a big, like there'd be a lot of clustering of challenges around certain technologies that might be addressed by this similar policy designs. And that would be something that I think is really important. Things like, what kind of zero carbon fuels might we need, and how are we going to move them around the country? We're going to need a lot of permitting. Are we going to need additional electricity transmission infrastructure? We're going to need a lot of permitting, and the list kind of goes on. And so I might arrange my recommendation list around those challenges. And I do think I might start somewhere with regulations and permitting, because we do have a lot of really interesting kind of quasi breakthrough technologies we're seeing. Joanna mentioned some, Jesse mentioned some. And I do think with additional regulatory and permitting support, we might be able to see some additional traction.
Yeah. No, I think these are great points. And really, I love how we keep kind of getting at these really thorny systems issues. And that's certainly, I think, on display when we talk about agriculture. I mean, one other element of all of this is that, deforestation is largely happening as a result of our global need for additional agriculture. And so when you think about the things that we need to do with respect to cows and methane and diet shifting, all of that is intimately connected with one of our most important carbon sinks, which are our forests. And I also really love how everyone's really, digging in on this relationship between policy and technology, and how we don't get to just kind of pick one thing. John Foley at Project Drawdown has some really great images to make it clear that we need to do all of the above. We need to be investing in technology so that they're ready, but we also need to be doing policy and a whole lot more business model innovation, other things to get greenhouse gas emissions down now. And one of the things I think that people kind of lose sight of is, something that I think Johanna mentioned, which is that the technology is actually really, relate very directly to the cost of the policy. So, particularly when you're talking about carbon dioxide removal, even if you don't think we need carbon dioxide removal right now, it's really important to reduce the cost of it, because that's really what sets the upper limit on a carbon price, right? Because you never have to pay more than it costs to just pull this stuff out of the atmosphere. So the cheaper we can make that, the easier it will be for policymakers to say yes to carbon pricing, because we know that there's a ceiling that's just a little bit lower. So
That's
Johanna,
right.
what do you have on this? Yeah.
Well, and I'll tie that back to your prior question, Laura. I think that's exactly right. So couldn't have said it better. The conclusion of that, though, that makes me quite worried, is that we're not really investing sufficient capital right now. Just put investors aside, because that's a different challenge. But from a government perspective or philanthropic, we're really not investing enough right now on greenhouse gas management. And so I think, I guess if Jesse's the home energy retrofit and Alex is the solar panels, I don't know, maybe I'm flood insurance or something, but we really do need to be focused on that now. And I know some of us have DOE in our heritage, and I think DOE is a really good example of the problem, where you don't have, well, I shouldn't pick on DOE, actually, just broadly in the US government. I mean, we don't have a place of excellence for greenhouse gas management. And I know some of the policies being proposed right now would seek to change that, which is good. But that's certainly putting us very, very far behind on the learning curve and on learning cycles. And, some approaches to try that'll fail fast, but others will succeed. I mean, I'm quite worried that we don't have enough shots on goal there. And it's a big problem. That could mean that we're not ready.
Yeah, agreed. So I think
and luckily there are companies that are starting to make their own commitments that could help both drive down the cost of the technology and help pave the way for some policy, as all these Fortune 500s start making commitments, really aggressive commitments that are committing to scope 3. So their entire supply chain now has to deliver on this. We become far less dependent on policy, and it's just this global movement.
So this is a big deal. So Microsoft, Stripe, Shopify, this is a big deal, and it's being seen, and it can serve as a first market. And that's great, right? When we support a new company, we want to see that they have a beachhead market, some toehold, where they can demonstrate the economics of their process or demonstrate that there's an off-taker for their product. And these companies can serve as that, which is amazing. It needs to then grow to be something else. And it's not yet clear if this voluntary market can grow to be that or will, but it's a huge deal.
One policy thing I thought was really effective and cool that I wonder how we could transform into something that would be relevant to this greenhouse gas management topic is the EV Everywhere subsidies for EV chargers at work. And I think the thinking there was, how do we cut battery prices? We've got to get EVs to be able to go further. And if you can instead turn the problem around and say, how can we get EVs to not have to go so far? Well, if the main place you drive to has a charger, then you only need half the battery. You just saved a lot of money. I'm trying to think if there's some analog to that in carbon capture and sequestration.
That's interesting. Yeah, could be on the value to be gained by the offtake, whether that's sequestering or utilization. That's interesting.
Yeah, the offtake is fun.
I would add to that, I think Joanna talked about CO2 to value, and I think if we think about that a little more broadly, and we think about creating markets, creating industries even that manage CO2, there aren't that many actually. I mean, you'd imagine there's a lot of energy being converted and a lot of CO2, but it's being released for the most part. And we find an interesting challenge, I think, that could create an opportunity to address what Jesse's talking about, is there's not a lot of interest in being a manager of a bunch of CO2, especially if there's not regulatory support in that space, right? So right now, in some cases, you might have to manage that CO2 if you store it underground and forever. And I think having policy that supports that and also encourages an opportunity for an industry to join, or for a new business unit as part of a company to play that role, I think that might help address that issue.
Yeah, and there's an interesting, again, analog, albeit a controversial one with the nuclear industry, right? And the need for government support to manage things on the waste side of the equation. I don't think anyone would claim that that's perfect, but there are certainly lessons to be learned there and potentially some ways to extend this. But this is really great, you guys. So I really want to end us on a positive note, and Jesse's already starting to take us there. Let's talk about some of the things that you think are really the most exciting positive developments, because one of the things that I've noticed in these dark days of the pandemic is how much discussion there has been nonetheless on climate change and on the urgency of the problem, and real movement toward making those corporate commitments, toward cities making commitments, toward new philanthropists coming to the table. Really interesting discussions happening, particularly at the state government level, and new commitments being made to research dollars and new kinds of institutions to support this. So what do you guys see as some of the most exciting developments, whether they're huge institutional developments, technologies that you think are going to make a big difference that haven't been there before, or other kinds of approaches to solving some of these systems challenges? Maybe Johanna, we'll start with you.
Sure. Three things came to mind when you asked the question. One of them I already talked about, so and so did Jesse, so I won't belabor, but it's the voluntary carbon markets that's starting up, and I think inspiring others to realize we don't necessarily always have to wait for policy. We can make markets ourselves. Similarly, along a similar line, you know, there are corporations. Amazon is the best example that I know that are taking this more seriously than I ever imagined, and doing an extremely detailed internal audits on their emissions and dedicating balance sheet capital to buying down those exact problems. So I think just the more that happens and gets publicized, the more we'll see others do it too. The second is new climate funds that are coming online. Basically, every time you turn around, there's a new climate fund being announced, which I think is a really good thing. I'm especially hopeful that a meaningful part of that capital will go toward, you know, funding the hardware-based technologies that we need for deep decarbonization, and not just focused on the software piece, although that's also important. But time will tell. But new climate funds coming online are, I think, a good example. And then the last one, we spoke a little bit about adaptation as the fourth pillar that's out of scope today, but this is something that I follow really closely. And one thing I'm excited about is a new crop of companies that's coming online, innovating in business models for how to make adaptation profitable, and things like restoration as a service, and kind of taking advantage of the ecotourism industry in ways that are healthy for our climate. So this is a really nascent thing that I think will become a trend, and I'm really hopeful about this crop of companies and their ability to deliver us on the fourth pillar when we need it.
Great, that's great. Alex, how about you? What are you excited about?
I talked about technology optionality a lot, so I hate to say one thing, but I would say one thing, and that's hydrogen. I'll be kind of brief, but it's crazy that even this morning I was talking to a utility executive who said she receives a phone call, at least one phone call every day on hydrogen. And so for those who don't know, it's you know, an fairly energy dense energy carrier, or sorry, energy rich dense energy carrier that when you consume it, it doesn't release any CO2. So usually the way that we make it, it's CO2 intensive, but there's ways to make it clean. And so if it burns clean and you make it clean, then it could be considered kind of a zero carbon fuel like tool. And so what's really important about it is that it has it potentially could help us decarbonize some of our most difficult to decarbonize sectors. So that might be heavy industry, as I mentioned, heavy duty transportation. It can help with high temperature process heating when consumed. So it touches a lot of sectors. It addresses issues that we find to be really difficult. And so as a result, it could have some transformational impact. I think we don't know exactly the role that it will play, but it definitely will play a role. I think it's very encouraging that we've seen this, interest from, energy companies. As I mentioned, hydrogen was featured in the 2020 Comprehensive Energy Act, and President Biden has talked about it from time to time, supporting clean hydrogen. And it also, as going back to my earlier remarks, it touches a lot of those things, the regional dynamics. You know, you could have different types of hydrogen hubs depending on your place in the country. You know, there's a lot of jobs potential there, of course, and it's cross-cutting. So I'm not saying that it's a silver bullet. I am saying though that it could, you know, could be a game changer, or at the very least play a role, and we need a technology optionality. So
yeah, agreed. Well, and you know, that's a subject that's near and dear to my heart, since in my former role at Exelon, one of the things we did was a pilot of clean hydrogen generation, which we were really excited about. And I think is hopefully the future, because goodness knows we need to decarbonize the hydrogen we have and potentially use some more of it. All right, so Jesse, over to you to wrap us up here. What do you think? What are you most excited about? What do you think is really going to get us there with greenhouse gas emissions reduction?
Yeah, I think in my good news category, certainly this kind of snowball effect of the public psyche really picking up energy around climate tech, from the voluntary markets to policy moving along, which creates tech costs, which are coming down, and new tech, and just getting more minds around this feels really, really hopeful. And like Johanna said, in the midst of a global pandemic, all of this happening is just really uplifting. And I think what comes along with that is new technologies being developed. Global Cooling Prize comes to mind as something that's a pretty cool beacon of people coming together and focusing on a problem where a single technology could address the 3% of emissions that are coming from air conditioning. And so getting a global community together around attacking something that's very specific, because this climate problem can feel staggering and we're not really sure where to start. But 3% is a huge number. It's more than all air travel combined. And if in a single appliance, we can have a big impact on that number, that's really hopeful. And finally, the new approaches. I'm still just very taken by companies that didn't set out to be clean tech companies and ended up being. So let me throw out a couple other examples. Nest did not set out to be a clean tech company. It's this sexy thing you put on your wall as kind of a status symbol, and yet it can enable you to have a house that's not only more comfortable and more convenient, but also more efficient. And Uber, likewise, almost certainly did not set out to be a clean tech company, but with Uber Pool and post-pandemic, we're going to see the way that people get around change to be, I think, a lot more efficient in time and in energy. So there's the good news in my mind.
I love it. This is great. Well, a lot to be hopeful for. So I think, really to wrap up here, what I'm hoping folks will take away from this is that, yes, this is a big, complicated problem. And, picking one single thing is not going to get us all the way there, but we need as many people as possible joining us in this fight and digging in, learning what you can, not taking no for an answer, but really looking for the things that together are going to break some of these barriers and get us where we need to go with respect to greenhouse gas reduction. So really want to thank all three of you, and I want to thank AILA for having us. We're really excited to do this and look forward to more folks joining us in the climate fight. Take care. Thanks.